Oh, hi. Welcome. I know this is a little odd. This is not the Eckerd way to teach a class online. You'll see this is probably the last time you'll ever see me teach a class without a tie on. But I wanted to cover some ground before we get too far behind. Give you a chance. I hope a few of you are with me today. Let me just see if I click over to my YouTube stream. Where is it? Live streaming. Is it working? Yeah, there we are. Good. Is anybody here? No. Oh, I'm all by myself. Oh well, but that's okay. You can watch this any old time. Just go into my channel on YouTube. I will leave it up here for the foreseeable future, probably at least until the end of the semester. And what I want to cover today, I'm hoping you can read the board behind me. But what I want to cover today would be what we would have gone over in the last few lectures. So this will be sort of a bit compressed compared to what I would normally do in the classroom. There'll be less. Obviously, there's basically no room for discussion unless a couple of people hop into the chat room. We can cover a few things. Any questions you have, but do please take notes as you watch this. And if you have questions, if there are things that don't quite make sense to you or you think are wrong or controversial, please jot that down and we can talk about that when you come back. And I will see you, I guess, next Tuesday. We will be back in our normal classroom, physically together in meet space. So just to give you a quick rundown of what I hope to get through in the next hour and a half, and again, it'll be pretty compressed. The first thing will be why now, meaning why are we especially interested in studies of stratification now? I know I mentioned to you in the first lecture that this was a pretty unpopular topic, even within sociology for a while there, from the sort of the late 70s through the early 2000s. But then after that, in the late 2000s, people really became interested in stratification again, and now it's kind of at the top, even of the political agenda. As we look through the supposed tax reform that's going through Congress right now, a lot of the questions that people have about that are, how will this affect the system of stratification in the United States? So first, we'll talk a little bit about that, although maybe it's even self-evident to some extent why we're interested in strat these days. Then, referencing the Grussky and Seleny readings, I want to talk about what the different components and parameters of stratification are, so that as we talk about different theories, we'll know sort of what to look for and what they're emphasizing versus other theorists and articles on stratification. So the different components of stratification systems, the different parameters through which we measure stratification systems. And then I'm going to try to compress what would have been this week when we've been off hiding from hurricanes. I've been without power for days and picking up sticks and doing all the live cooking dinners on a charcoal grill. It's like I don't know. This is the experience of the third world or something. I don't know, whatever. But we haven't been talking. So while I've been doing that, I haven't been talking to you about Marx and Weber, and so I want to give you at least a cursory introduction to those classical studies of social stratification. Obviously, Marx and Weber are from the 19th and early 20th century, but the way that they looked at things is still highly influential to contemporary studies of stratification. Okay, so first I'll check for any questions. Does anybody join me? And no, I'm all by myself here. All right, so I'll stop doing that for a while and delve right into this why now question. So Just to extract a few things. Sorry, this is the Grussky and Seleny, the Grussky and Weishaupt, the other one. Just to highlight a few of the big answers. Why are we interested in social stratification right now? Why would we even quantify it, qualify it as a social problem? A few things, right? There's takeoff. And what that means is that society has become much more highly stratified than in previous eras, or at least in terms of comparing the last 10, 20 years of the 20th century, the first couple decades of the 21st century. There's much greater social stratification compared to sort of mid-century, mid-20th century, especially in the United States and Europe. And so that's surprising and concerning to people. And to sort of put that in sort of general terms, what that means when we say that stratification has taken off, we mean that basically the rich have gotten a lot richer, and there are a lot fewer of them, and the poor have gotten quite a bit poorer. That's what we mean by the takeoff. And so if we look at a sort of if we chart it out, do a sort of a histogram of stratification, sort of an ideal, a totally unstratified society would be just everybody living in one bar here. Right, so if we're charting the number of people in the population against their money, basically speaking, whether we put that in terms of annual earnings or wealth, a totally unstratified society would say that everybody, same number of all the people, have roughly the same amount of money. Obviously, no society has displayed those essential features, but there are greater and lesser versions of that. So we can see a sort of a relatively unstratified distribution would be a society where there's some poor people, there's some very wealthy people, most people fall somewhere in the middle there. But what we've seen, and sort of, in a very kind of caricaturish sense, that's where America was sort of headed in the mid-20th century, where the developed nations were headed. But what we see, especially in the post-1970s era, is that we develop a sort of a big tail, a long tail to the right. So you have the mass of people kind of falling in the middle or lower middle class, a certain good-sized proportion of people falling in below the poverty line, and then this very thin but long tail off here of the 1%ers, of the very wealthy, living lives radically different from the rest of us. And so that kind of takeoff is concerning to people, and you see that especially in things, in 2011 it was the Occupy Wall Street movement being concerned with these 1%ers, right? Those 1% of people who are way off on the right side of the distribution, making tons and tons of money. In the most recent election, it was the Bernie bros, or the folks really interested in the Sanders campaign, were largely concerned with those questions of social stratification and how much more wealthy the very wealthy people had gotten. Of course, that's part of Trump's allure as well, in saying, well, the working class has gotten left behind. It just has a very different sort of way of thinking that we might overcome that. So that's the takeoff. answer in a nutshell. We're also concerned with what we call externalities. And those are, this is a very kind of general term from economics. When you look at a phenomenon, you look at its externalities, which means those things that are external to it that it causes. So we are concerned with stratification, generally speaking, in and of itself, the fact that some people are rich and some people are poorer, but obviously we're also concerned about the effects of stratification, and those we call the externalities. And there are some very serious macro level externalities to social stratification. And at the macro level, sociologists look at things like terrorism. Right, so to the extent that some people feel very disaffected because of economic conditions, the argument goes those people are much more susceptible to committing terrorism. Unrest in general, so political unrest, where people, whether leaving aside terrorism, political unrest generally speaking, so something like the Occupy movement or general strikes in countries in Europe, those kinds of things, are seen as an externality of social stratification, a big problem for society. And of course, at the micro level, this is probably the stuff you tend to think about a bit more when you think about poverty and the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. The micro level effects of stratification are things like poor health or unequal political participation. So it's been pretty clear, again, in the sort of the broader American political debates of the last 10 to 20 years, poor people experience much worse health in the United States than rich people do, than better off people do. And that's true globally, certainly, as well. I'm going to try to scoot you a little bit closer to the screen here, or to the whiteboard. Yeah, because that looks to me like it would be hard to read. So, can you read me now? Yeah, okay. Can you read me now? That looks a little bit better. Okay, cool. So, going back now, right, so we have those sort of externalities, and then I'm skipping over a certain amount of stuff to really highlight the things that I think are really important for us to pay attention to. The last thing I want to point up here is what Grussky calls the ideographic account, which is basically just to say that this stuff is important in the culture right now. And so they point out Katrina, and that is a good example, but clearly right now, Harvey and, I'm already forgetting, I'm trying not to remember. Okay, Harvey and Irma are both much more problematic for poor people than they are for rich people. And I haven't seen too much of this account yet with Irma, but certainly you saw with Katrina, the people who died were by and large poor and black. And that really kind of brought the question of stratification into the popular culture at that point. And I think I'm starting to see sort of some of this coverage in the popular media of like saying like, you know, well, who's really screwed by Irma? It's, you know, we know that the very rich people whose houses had their roofs torn off in the Keys, you know, they're suffering. But the sort of the mass of suffering and the really life-changing and in certain cases life-ending effects of the hurricane have been in places like the poorer neighborhoods of Barbuda or in trailer parks in the United States that have been utterly devastated and where people have really lost, you know, the entirety of their possessions. And I haven't looked at the death statistics yet, but it seems that the deaths that have occurred and are continuing to occur from these disasters are being more heavily borne by poor people who can't afford to flee or who can't afford better housing. So we'll see that as well in things like evicted, right? So these things are just sort of out there in the popular culture. Right now, the recession certainly turned an eye to this, although at this point that's starting to fade. But what we did notice, and again, I think the 2016 election is a good example of this, is that some people really feel that it never recovered from the recession. So the recession was officially in 2009 to 2011, but the effects continue to be felt. Again, a lot of those Trump voters who were really kind of feeling disaffected, that disaffectation was in many respects about them not being able to find jobs after the official end of the recession, and so there's this scapegoating of Canadian softwoods or Mexican immigrant labor is really tied to this effect where they think that the jobs just aren't coming back and they need to find somebody to blame that upon. So again, this is mostly just to say that these issues of stratification are very visible in the public sphere at this point in our history, and so people are really turning to study stratification once again. And it's a hot topic, both in the popular media, but also when you go to meetings of sociologists or you read in the journals. This is what people are talking about these days. Wanted to highlight one particular dimension of this article as well, and that is with respect to what Grussky terms benign and less benign narratives. Oops, less benign narrative. And what we're getting at here is that with these concerns about stratification, we're moving to what we call the less benign narratives. So whereas a benign narrative would be to say stratification, no big deal, maybe it's even good for society, and we'll look at some theorists later on that say, well, maybe it's important to have some stratification. So stratification, no big deal, maybe it's even good for society. That's the benign narrative. So strat, not bad, is giving way to the less benign narrative. Let's call that strat real bad. And again, we see that, especially in the popular media, in terms of things like, whoa, poor people are like dying because they're poor. Maybe that's a problem. There's that, but there's also, on the social scientific side, what we call the sort of the failure of the Kuznets curve. And so it's important to know what the Kuznets curve is. So Kuznets was a economist, theorist in the mid 20th century, who posited, and he had good data to sort of support this, that as industrialization proceeds, you undergo a increasing rate of stratification in society, or increasing degree of stratification in society. So if you go to the pre-industrial era, there was a relatively low, on the y-axis here, right, degree of stratification. Pretty low degree of stratification. Through the industrial era, oops, I don't want to blow the surprise here. Okay, through the industrial era, stratification increases radically. And what that is about is factory owners consolidating incredible amounts of wealth, under their own control, and leaving workers with really little to no wealth at all. So, if you look back at the sort of the great industrialists of the 20th century, you look to your Carnegies, to your Rockefellers, to your McCormicks, and so on and so on. Those guys had a fantastic amount of wealth, and we say, in that gilded age, the late 19th century, social stratification was huge in America. There was a huge spread between the richest and the poorest in society. Turning to the mid-20th century, and this is where Kuznets comes in, Kuznets' curve suggested that stratification was declining and would decline. And that was sort of seen as an almost evolutionary or natural state of things. And we can tie this to a number of factors. You can tie this to the growth of the welfare state. You can tie this to the growth of union power. You can tie this to the sort of, to the fact that, at a certain point, people like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts saw, a certain danger into concentrating too much wealth in their hands, and so they enacted all kinds of philanthropic projects. But for any number of reasons, you see through the mid 20th century. There's the shorthand. There's 20C for 20th century. Through the mid 20th century, a decline in the degree of social stratification. And if you look back to the popular culture, you can sort of see some of this, in the Leave It to Beaver homes, and the fact that everybody had 2 cars in their garage and a white picket fence and a bungalow house, and that was really not unusual. That was not something just for the middle class. That was a working class phenomena in the United States, and so people in Kuznets, thought that trend was going to continue, and we'd sort of reach a ever decreasing degree of stratification in society. Lo and behold, in roughly the 1960s and 1970s, something changes, and since then, stratification has taken off once again. So this is, roughly, I'll put the date at 1973, sort of arbitrarily, what theorists have kind of posited is that around that time we enter what is called the post-industrial era. You see things like jobs being exported to Asia to South America. You see the growth of the knowledge economy. These are all things we'll talk about in more depth throughout the course. But the bottom line is that stratification takes off once again in the Western democracies. So this is the point at which the Kuznets curve fails. Right, so it turns out that stratification doesn't decline, it takes off. And this then feeds in once more to these less benign narratives about stratification. It's not getting better, it's actually getting worse. And we'll do some things, again, we'll look at some empirical studies that will quantify for that for us. Okay, so hopefully that all makes some sense to you. And now I want to turn to these to this question of the components and the parameters of stratification systems, so we can kind of understand what it is that we're talking about when we say, oh yeah, this system of stratification is different than this system of stratification. You know, stratification in China is different from social stratification in the United States. Or if we look at social stratification this way, things don't look so bad. But if we look at it this way, well, maybe it looks a little bit worse, right? So it really depends on how you measure it. And this is, by the way, if you're keeping track, this is in the Grussky and Weishar reading. The Grussky and Weishar. So, when we talk about the components of stratification, we mean first that we define certain goods as valuable. And it's important here to note that we're not always talking about money when we talk about stratification. Clearly, certainly, most of the time, that's what it comes down to. And we'll see as we'll talk a little bit about Marx in a bit. You know, a Marxist reduces pretty much everything to the money question, to the economic, the material question. But there are other ways to consider stratification in any given society. So these goods, like I say, it can be money, but it can also be something like honor. It's not, you know, for Americans in the 21st century, and I think, you know, kind of America in general throughout its history, we've had this more or less egalitarian ethos that has really prevented too much in terms of honorifics in our society. But you can see, especially in older European societies, in Germany, you'll see this in terms of whether you call somebody, so that there are two words to say you, right? If you know, like, how are you doing? There's du and there's sie, and that's really a question of honor. Whether you, so if you talk to somebody as du, it means that they are sort of on a same level as you, or maybe lower down. So you talk to your little brother or your friends, you say du. When you say sie, you're talking to somebody who has more honor than you do. So, when you meet your girlfriend's dad, you call him Sie, and my German's not good enough to come up with a sentence for that, right? But that's just the example here. So you use those sort of honorific terms, and that's, that is important. That makes a difference. That makes a difference in how people experience society. So that is a different kind of good. Maybe more formally, you could consider the case of England and how they hand out those honorific terms, Sir, I don't know, Sir John Gielgud. That doesn't mean anything to you at this point. But they'll give really honored celebrities knighthoods, right? They'll say, oh, now he's Sir so and so, Sir Paul McCartney. What? I don't know. Again, that's a valuable good. It's different than money. So we have those kinds of things. Education. America is clearly stratified by education. Some people have more of it. Some people have less of it. A bachelor's from DeVry University is not considered the same as a bachelor's from Eckerd, as a bachelor's from Harvard University, right? So those kinds of things do make a difference. All right, so we have these processes that define certain goods as valuable. That's one component of the stratification system, and that's the kind of the basis of all of this. And then we have rules of allocation, which is basically to say, how do you get it? How do you get money? Well, you have a certain kind of job, or you're born into it. How do you get honor? Well, the queen decides, yeah, you're pretty cool. Here, have some honor, right? That's the rules for the allocation of the good. How do you get a certain kind of education? Well, you can go through the example yourself. But there's money to pay for the schools, or there's test scores that are required to get into better versus worse schools, and so on and so forth. But whatever the good there is in a society that it sees as valuable, there's some way to get it. There are some way or socially defined ways to acquire that good. And again, by saying allocation, we're suggesting a certain degree of scarcity here. Not everybody can get a BA from Harvard. It has to be allocated. There are certain people who can get that and certain people who just won't. And so there are certain particular rules by which people are able to get those things or not. And then finally, with respect to the components, we talk about the mobility mechanisms, which basically speaking is how to get people to spots. So this could be something like, there's a certain amount of money that's allocated to the, and I've sort of kind of mixed you up here a little bit, right? So this is really allocation to positions, and mobility is more with respect to actual individuals. So if we say, that the system allocates a certain amount of resources to people who have certain, or to certain jobs in the system. So CEOs are paid better, right? So more wealth is allocated to CEOs. The mobility question is, how do people get to be CEOs, right? So how do the people get into those spots? What you're probably beginning to sense, though, is that all of this stuff is often kind of tied together. And that's where we move. I hope that's clear, and if there's questions, we can cover that again on Tuesday rather. The question is, right, how do all these things relate to each other? And that's where we start getting into to what they call the parameters of a stratification system. So with respect to this, again, we've already kind of covered this. First of all, we're worried about the overall amount of stratification. And again, that's, if you'll recall, that's the question of, is the distribution really even, or is it really uneven? And if you've taken strat at this point, or even if you haven't, or sorry, statistics, not strat. This is strat. If you take statistics at this point, you'll know that there are a lot of different ways that distributions can be shaped. Right, so this is a really kind of a key sort of basic question where we ask, how much stratification is there in the society? What does it basically look like? That's we're looking for this overall amount of stratification. We know that things can be really unstratified, or things can be really highly stratified. And the different shape of that is, certainly a matter of concern for students of stratification. Then we move to the question of rigidity. Which is to say, how stuck are either people in positions or the system in general. So it really kind of depends on the level of focus. So we could talk on one hand about the system being rigid if generation after generation after generation it's CEOs who make a ton of money and fast food workers or low-level service workers who make barely any money at all. That could be seen as a rigid system. We can also take this at the level of people. So the rigidity question for people is often looked at in terms of intergenerational mobility, intergenerational or intragenerational mobility. And we will, in a few weeks, be looking at studies that specifically interrogate this question of mobility. And so, again, this is looking at, with respect to people, intergenerational mobility means, so your dad was a stock boy and you're now a lawyer, right? That's intergenerational mobility. Your dad was a working class guy, now you are a upper class, or at least upper middle class professional. So across different generations, there has been some change, to the extent that that is possible, we say that a system has relatively lower or higher mobility. If it's impossible for the son of a stock boy to rise up to anything, to being anything other than being a stock boy or some other kind of working class job, we say that that system that society has a high degree of rigidity. So we can look at it intergenerationally across the generations, from fathers and mothers to sons and daughters. We can also look at it within a particular generation, and intragenerational social mobility means, can you as an individual start out life maybe as, again, I'll pick on stock boys. Can you start off as a stock boy? I don't know if did anybody watch your Better Call Saul? Right, this is one example of this, where Saul actually starts off, I guess, in the mailroom. Right, and this is a classic sort of American Horatio Alger kind of story. Americans love to believe that there is not much rigidity and that they can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So the Better Call Saul example is this guy, Jimmy, who starts off in the mailroom and studies hard at night, goes to some kind of online law school, takes the bar exam, becomes a lawyer, right? So he rises as an individual. We call that intragenerational mobility. So across the scope of your lifetime, can you overcome or kind of get past wherever you were initially placed? We need to look at the role of ascription. And we'll be considering particular kinds of ascription later in the semester. The thing when we talk about ascription, these are traits defined at birth. Usually at birth. We could also call something like becoming handicapped is also an ascribed trait. So maybe not just birth, but by no choice of your own. So what we're really saying here is that society defines you in this particular way. And I guess most pointedly within the United States, in really most societies, there are at least a couple of really important dimensions of ascription that we will consider in some depth later in the course. First and maybe foremost in the United States is race and ethnicity. And we know that race and ethnicity have a lot to do with determining other dimensions of stratification. So we will look to try to understand, why it is, or how much discrimination there is in the job market against minorities, how that plays out in terms of differential wages and life chances, that sort of thing. So race and ethnicity we'll study in some depth, and also certainly gender. To be honest and forthright, we don't get too much beyond just the kind of the male-female distinction in this course, and there's only, I would say, a relatively small amount of study that's been done about discrimination against LGBTQ people. It's out there. It's a relatively small area of study. at this point. So when we talk about gender, we're really just kind of going to be sticking with the binary, and often talking about heterosexual gender issues. So we'll be talking a lot about moms versus dads, that kind of thing. But overall, what the question really is is there discrimination? Is there gender typing in jobs? Certainly, obviously, there need not be. And there are certain societies where there is much less emphasis on description by gender, but many, maybe probably most societies, have quite a complex built around gender to assign men and women to very different roles in society. And traditionally, almost all societies are allocating more rewards to the positions that are more held by men. Whew. One second. Excuse me. All right. Finally, do I have space on there? Yeah, you can see if I write over here, I think. The final parameter of stratification that we're going to worry about is the level of crystallization. And what we're essentially meaning by crystallization is how much do all these different things hang together. So how much do the different dimensions, what this would be with this would really be turning back to the earlier discussion of the components of stratification. How much do those different components, like honor and education and wealth and income, how much do they stick together? How is that tied maybe to race and ethnicity? So again, to put it in sort of a, how would you say? To put it in sort of a statistical frame, so you'd say, is there a high correlation or intercorrelation intercorrelation between different dimensions? So that would be like education and wealth and race and honor. If you have the right race, we'll look a little bit in a minute at Weber's discussion of this in respect to caste, if you're in the really traditional Indian caste society, which is fading at this point, but if you were born into the warrior caste, if you're really one of the high caste people, that is actually essentially an ethnicity, and you are much more honored than people of lower castes. You tend to have occupations that are much better paid, and to the extent that you're involved in higher education, your educational opportunities are better than people of other castes, this kind of thing. If all of those things hang together, there's a relatively high degree of crystallization in society. And so now, if there aren't any questions about that, and I don't see any, okay, I'm going to move on then to talk about Marx. And actually, this is kind of a good point to get to Marx, because Marx is somebody who believes that crystallization is very high. And especially in considering the society of mid-19th century England and Europe more generally that he was studying, he really saw everything as coming down to economics. And he saw honor as being tied to economics. So the person who is, the better person, or is favored by God even, is the wealthy person. And concomitantly, if you're poor, you kind of deserve it, and you're not getting an education, and you're not honorable, and you're not morally good even, right? So Marx believed that everything came down to wealth, to economics. But stepping back from that for a moment, I think a good place to start with Marx is to look at why he cares in the first place. And this sort of harkens back a little bit to the why now discussion that Grussky and Seleny outlined for us. With Marx, I think it's even more serious than anything Grussky discusses. So for Marx, the chief outcome of stratification and this is specifically under capitalism, is alienation. So people working under capitalism, which is, to put it very basically, right, is the reinvestment of profits into a business. And the kind of the chief thing here is that there are two classes: the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And I can't remember if there's anybody who's in sociological theory, right, or theories of society right now who's also in this class, but you'll kind of note there's a whole lot of overlap at the very beginning of these two classes. So you can just shut your brain off for a couple of minutes while I sort of rehash the Marx that we discussed the other day. But for Marx, what capitalism is about is the existence of two classes economically defined, the one being the bourgeoisie, who are the property owners, the other being the proletariat, who are the propertyless workers. Propertyless workers. And just generally speaking, hopefully, to keep this all together for you, that what we call that property that capitalists own is capital. Right? The capitalist owns capital in the form of things like real estate, factories, raw materials, transportation networks. Again, we're talking about the 19th century here, so we're talking about people who are making things like farm implements or textiles or steam locomotives and steamships. Right? These guys own all the stuff that's necessary to make stuff. The only thing that propertyless workers own is their labor power. The only thing they own is their labor power, and so that makes them ripe for exploitation by the bourgeoisie. Now, why is this important? You know, you might think like, well, hey, you got a job. It's better than being on a farm. Maybe it's better than being like a shoemaker, right? Sitting there with your leather and I don't know how to make a shoe. Whatever it takes to make a shoe. Maybe being a factory worker is better than being a shoemaker. And Marx says, no, it's not, right? And so this is, if nothing else, a really good introduction for us to understand why people are concerned with systems of stratification. And what Marx is saying is that stratification in capitalism is so horrible as to actually reduce your humanity and alienate you from yourself and from everybody else in the world. So this is here, this outcome of stratification for him is alienation. And what does that mean? There are four different aspects of alienation that we have to consider. And so those are from the product of your labor. Two, from the act of production and from yourself. Three, from your species being. We'll talk about that, because I know that's not a term we use every day. I should say the species being, from the species being. The species being humankind, Homo sapiens. And fourth, from other human beings. So first, when you work in capitalism, you're alienated from the product of your own labor. What Marx is saying here is that compared to that shoemaker who, and again, I don't know exactly what this means, but you get some leather, you get some wood, I don't know, some shoelaces, you put it together, you spend 4 hours in a morning, and at the end of the time, you have a shoe. You can recognize that as the product of your labor. You know, you have an idiosyncratic style of stitching or designing the toe of a shoe or whatever it may be. Once you've made that thing, though, it's almost a part of yourself. To Marx, it's really an extension of who you are, and you can see yourself in it. However, under capitalist production, if you're just working on an assembly line and you're just the guy who cuts out the tongues to shoes, there's nothing really special that you do to make that tongue yours. And at the end of the day, when there's a pile of Nikes off at the end of the assembly line, you don't go and say, that tongue, that's a great tongue. You don't have that. You don't possess that kind of ownership over the products of your labors. Even what he's saying is, even once the shoemaker sells a shoe, he can go into the village and see somebody wearing a shoe, 10 years later and say, that's a great shoe. That's when I was doing that certain kind of special thing with the sole, and I don't do it anymore, but that's cool. You don't have that kind of ownership anymore. Under capitalism, in fact, any sort of idiosyncratic production methods are discouraged. Right? We want every Nike to be exactly the same. So you're alienated from that thing you do, which he says, he's emphasizing, this is fundamentally what being a human being is about. What being a human being is about is producing stuff, doing stuff, making things. If that goes away from you and is no longer a part of you, you're alienated from reality. So you're alienated from the product of labor, you're alienated from the act of production, and from yourself. You don't feel like yourself when you're at work. Again, this stupid shoemaker thing that I've come up with, the shoemaker making shoes, presumably that's what he chose to do at some point in his life, and that is the outcome of his personal growth. But if you're working in a factory, most of the time you're just taking whatever job you can get. It has very little to do with yourself, and you don't even really feel like yourself when you're doing this work that you're doing. Buddy the Elf. Remember Buddy the Elf? Right? You watch Elf? Why this? I don't know why certain examples come to mind, right? But Buddy the Elf. Wait, no, he's not a good example. I'm thinking of the other elf from. See, this is when it really helps to have people in the classroom because you can remind me of things. The elf in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Remember? What was his name? Nothing. The elf. So there's an elf in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer who wants to be a dentist. See, this is I'm going somewhere with this, believe me. The elf in Rudolph wants to be a dentist, but the story is a strange kind of metaphor for capitalist production. It's
Google says it's Hermie.
Hermie the elf. Right? And he even sings little songs about how he wants to be a dentist, and the sort of spoiler alert, the key conflict with the abominable snowman is resolved when Hermie is actually able to extract a rotten tooth from the abominable snowman and end his toothache, because that's who Hermie really is. But working in Santa's workshop is alienated labor under capitalism. Santa is in fact the capitalist. And excuse me. And again, that's kind of a goofy example, but it really is sort of the metaphor for labor under capitalism. If you wanted to be a dentist, tough shit, right? You got to go. The only thing you own as a member of the proletariat is your labor power. And so you're going to work in whatever factory, you're going to work in whatever toy workshop, making whatever toys, and not really feeling like yourself. Right? The only time, he says, you feel like yourself is when you're at home, when you're eating, or doing whatever kind of animal activities you're doing. And he's saying that's not really being a human being. Okay, so you're alienated from the product of your labor, you're alienated from the act of production itself, and therefore yourself. You're alienated from the species being. We've kind of alluded a bit to this already, but what the species being, is Marx's idea that human beings are really supposed to be what he calls universal producers. We're supposed to produce for the species. We're supposed to see in the work that we do a sort of an advancement for the species as a whole. And you might imagine, I don't know if Marx ever went here, but like, when you go on a mammoth hunt, right? So early man going on mammoth hunts to advance the whole village. That's a sort of an advancement of the species being. You're taking part in something greater than yourself, and you advance the tribe, the species, through your human activity. If you're working in Santa's workshop, just cranking out toys, the only thing you're working for is like to put a roof over your head and to eat some elf food, whatever that is. You're not thinking like, oh, these toys, and maybe this is Marx's sort of. It's arguable. Certainly, there are probably people who work in factories who see their work as being really important for humankind. And when we talk about Durkheim, we'll see it's a very different take on things. But for Marx, not there. You don't see it as important for anything but just to kind of survive from one day to the next. You're not advancing the species. And finally, you're alienated from other people. When you go on that mammoth hunt, like you feel, whatever, the brotherhood and sisterhood of humankind going out to kill a mammoth. You're doing it together. You're all in this together. When you are working under capitalism, you're only in it for yourself. You're only in it for yourself and maybe for your family. And, if you can do faster and better work than the next guy to you on the line, you're going to do it even if it screws him. Again, this is Marx's theory of things. We have later studies of factory work under capitalism that question certain details of this, but I think it really is fundamentally important for us to understand that these are posited as the effects of a particular system of stratification. And again, this is the system of stratification under capitalism, where you are a member of the proletariat or of the bourgeoisie. And if you are a member of the proletariat, all you have is this labor power and total alienation. And by the way, the capitalist doesn't the capitalist doesn't escape alienation either, right? The capitalist is stuck being alienated from other human beings just as much as the proletariat is. The capitalist, does not feel like what he is doing is being done to advance any sort of human species agenda. He is just trying to make his pile of capital bigger so that then he can take other pieces of that pile out and, buy another factory, buy another train line, and maybe at some point, go get a bunch of cocaine and whiskey and have a good time. And even that, honestly, is to Marx a sign of alienation, right? So all of the sort of the strange excesses and self-abuse that's done by the wealthy are a sign that they are highly alienated people themselves. So the other thing I wanted to really highlight from Marx here is, in addition to this as sort of a really important early statement on the effects of stratification, is to highlight first this notion that class is all about economic position, and it's the only important thing. So when we talk about sort of the different components of a stratification system per Grussky, right, the only one that Marx is concerned about is how economic power is allocated. He's not worried about honorifics. He's not worried about ethnicity, anything like that, because he says it can all be boiled down to economics. All that other cultural stuff is epiphenomenal to the economic situation. Then I think it's important to also note this distinction that he makes here between class in itself and class for itself. So what he's getting at here is that, and this is, if you want to sort of go back to the readings, this is in the reading that's titled "On Classes in Capitalism and Pre-Capitalism," which is largely from the manifesto, the Communist Manifesto, and you'll get to a passage in here where he's kind of giving the history of the proletariat. And so, I'm going to give myself some more space here now. So, at earlier points in its history, the proletariat merely exists as what we would call a class in itself. Klasse an sich, if you want to be German about it. And what this means is that they share objective conditions but they're unaware of it. And really unaware of, I guess, their similarities. They're in conflict with each other. This is, what I was talking about before about the sort of the alienation from one another. Because proletariat workers are alienated from one another, they are fighting against each other. They're not working with each other. But it should be noted, a class in itself is always observable by, I'll just say an outsider. I don't want to say a sociologist because Marx didn't think of himself really as a sociologist. The term didn't even exist then. Right, but somebody, let's say objectively. The subjective experience of the proletariat worker is not one of oh, we're all in it together against the man. It's like, no, I'm in it for myself, and screw that guy and screw that other guy next to me on the line because I need to make my money so I don't die, right? But an outside observer like Marx or Engels could come along and say, like, look at you people, you're all just working for the man. Obviously, you're all the members of the same class. We need to show you people how this all works. And what he describes then, goes on to describe in the manifesto, is how that undergoes a transition to a class for itself. And when they become a class for themselves, they do things like form unions, become self-aware,
And ultimately, and I should emphasize, well, a couple of things, right? There is a sense in which this doesn't just happen, but intellectuals like Marx and Engels come along and say, hey, you guys, hey, you're all the members of the same class. I know you're fighting with each other and you think that Larry on the next shoemaking machine is out to get you, but really the guy who's out to get you is the owner, right? Is the capitalist who's up there exploiting you, right? So you need the intellectuals there to teach, these guys who are the outside observers, to teach members of the proletariat class that they exist as a class for themselves, to build this self-awareness. And the other side of this, though, is that he sees it all as inevitably leading to revolution. So inevitably, the class that forms together for itself will revolt, will take up arms and overthrow the previously dominant class. I mean, it's important in terms of Marxist history. It's not super important in terms of this course to know this, right? But that revolt will lead to communism. What is, and by the way, that's the end of history. What? Okay, yeah, that's the end of history for Marx. Yeah, he believed that was the reality. That was it. That was that. Okay, once the proletariat revolts, then we get the communist utopia. We abolish class. We abolish private property. Good night, Irene. Okay, but I don't need you or necessarily want you to devote yourself to communist ideology, to communist reasoning, I guess let's say, to the communist dialectic, to the Marxist dialectic of history, what we call a teleology, a sort of inevitable procession of history towards a particular end goal. Don't have to go there. If you want to, though, good for you. You can do that. Okay, and there's a lot that's been written, by Marx and others about that. But what I do really generally want you to get from this is his sense that a class A is defined by its economic conditions, and B can exist either as a class in itself, unaware of its, with the individuals unaware of their shared condition, and then transform into a class for themselves. And also, this is a general form of history. Okay, this is a way of looking at history, and this could be a way you use to look at different societies. So Marx doesn't get too much into it in the readings that we have here, but just as he's saying that the proletariat would revolt and form the communist state, if you go back historically, as Marx does in plenty of his other writings, he would look at the capitalists existing as a class at a certain point as just a class in themselves, at a later point as a class for themselves, and they actually formed the revolutions especially in France and the United States, where they overthrew the monarchy. So they replaced mercantilist accumulation, which we don't need, again, don't need the details there. If you want to, all kinds of great stuff written about mercantilism, right? Three-way trade between England and the colony thing. That's mercantilism. They replaced that with capitalism by overthrowing the kings in their respective kingdoms, and that became eventually a world historical revolution, such that capitalism took over the world. Again, Marx says, capitalism is going to be on the way out. So far, haven't seen it. We will talk in a little bit more depth about that. And it looks like I'm really running short on time now. Let me just give you one last tidbit from Marx that is, also just a sort of a tidbit in your reading. So there's a quick excerpt from the German ideology in the Stratification reader, and that will be sort of our last key concept for the day. And by the way, I will be publishing these lists of key concepts on Moodle once I have better internet connectivity. Again, like I say, my house, there's no electricity and therefore no Wi-Fi. I got generators from my neighbors running 24/7 in my ears. I don't know if I'm a little weird today. Excuse me. I'm not sleeping very well. It's very weird. You wake up every 30 minutes or so and there's like a droning engine. But it's okay. All right, we'll get through this, and I'll eventually get back on Moodle and publish all the stuff that you need to see. Ideology. Ideology is also part and parcel of Marxian theory, and where it's really important for us to understand it, I think, is as defense of the status quo. Right, so the defense of things as they were, or even as they were before. Status quo ante, like the state before now. Making America great again. What he is saying is that ideology comes from the ruling class. And it hides reality behind ideas. Or perhaps better put, it justifies a particular reality with stories. A good one that's just been on my mind lately because I've been reading the narrative of Frederick Douglass. Right, so Frederick Douglass was a slave in early 19th century America, and he keeps making reference to the story of Ham. Ham. This was really the defense of slavery, or a important defense of slavery in especially the abolitionist era in the 1830s to the 1860s or so. Excuse me, in America, the story of Ham is that, and this is not the delicious lunch meat, this is the 13th tribe of Israel. And this is go back to Genesis. You can read this story, and I'm forgetting who Ham's dad was, but it's one of those guys, maybe Jacob, maybe. had a bunch of kids, and Ham was the one who, and the rest of them formed like the original 12 tribes of Israel, and went off and became the Jews, and then were sort of absorbed into the Judeo-Christian tradition, and so those guys are all right. Ham screwed up somehow, got sent off from the promised land, to careen through misadventures over the millennia. Slave owners and slave traders in the 18th, 19th century came back with this story that Africans were in fact the descendants of Ham, were therefore these people unfavored by God, and therefore it's okay to exploit them. No problem, go for it, it's ordained by God. What is this? This is crazy. This is just like a just so made up story, taking the Bible, using it for whatever sort of nefarious purpose you want to. That's a great example of ideology, right? This is not the reality. There's no, historical evidence that these guys, that all of Africa is the descendant of Ham. Of course, that, flies in the face of any real history, even, in the 19th century. But it's a great story that justifies a particular set of economic conditions that are beneficial to the ruling class, and therefore that becomes the dominant ideology of slave ownership. Marx, really this is where he's often picking on religion, as you probably heard, where he says that religion is the opium of the people. It has been used, so Marx argues, at any number of times by the ruling class. Religion has been used to defend the state of things as they are. And so, you could go to the New Testament and look at Jesus' defenses of poverty, where he says things like, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. Well, Marx would say that's a very nice way to make it so that poor people will want to stay poor, so that poor people will be satisfied in their exploitation by capitalists. In more contemporary times, Marxists have written about how TV shows provide a certain ideology. Even how weird stuff like the stories of hookers with a heart of gold defend the system of prostitution. Those kinds of things are all what Marx calls ideology, made up ideas that defend a certain state of reality, but that don't accurately reflect that reality. And again, for Marx to understand and reflect reality, what you really ultimately need to do is to look at the economic conditions under which people actually live. Okay, I'm gonna put a period on Marx there. Afraid we did not get to Weber today, but we will go back and catch him on Tuesday, right? So, God willing, we will be in our regular classroom, 10 o'clock on Tuesday. I hope you all have safe flights. Do try to, like I've been saying, keep up with the readings, keep up with the Moodle assignments, but I will be giving you some extensions there, I think basically through the end of the month as you try to catch up on this and your other courses. And I really look forward to seeing you in person once again and not doing this kind of strange artificial reality here. I feel like I'm in a fishbowl. Bye-bye.